I remember it like it was yesterday. I always liked the quiet of the local library. It was the perfect place to study and focus without distractions. That semester was the hardest one in college, so I would go to the library at specific times when I knew it would be quieter. Everything seemed normal until I started noticing a peculiar man who showed up at the same times I did. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a slightly disheveled appearance, always hiding behind big books. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. After all, the library is a public place. But soon I realized that his eyes were fixed on me, peeking out from behind the books. That persistent gaze started to bother me. I tried to ignore him and focus on my studies, but it was impossible. I could feel his presence watching me, following me through the aisles. My heart would race every time I heard his footsteps getting closer. No matter how hard I tried to avoid him, he always showed up at the same times I did. One day, as I was leaving the library, he blocked my path. I looked at him, trying to stay calm, but inside I was trembling with fear. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those unsettling eyes. That's when I realized this wasn't just a coincidence. That man was following me, tormenting me. Another afternoon, I was back at the library, deep into a textbook, when I saw that strange man approaching again. My heart raced as I recognized his familiar face. He sat down next to me and started talking, his voice low and almost whispering. He wanted to know what I was reading, why I chose that particular book, and even what I thought about the darker themes in literature. His questions were strange and disturbing, and they didn't fit with the seemingly peaceful environment of the library. There was something unsettling about his words, as if he was looking for something beyond a casual conversation. As days went by, he kept appearing, getting closer and closer. His questions became more personal, invading my privacy. I tried to ignore him and focus on my studies, but his presence was suffocating. I felt like he was always watching me, always lurking, as if he knew exactly where I would be at any given moment. The feeling of being watched and pursued began to torment me. I couldn't concentrate properly anymore. My mind kept wandering what he wanted from me. I knew I had to do something, but I was afraid to confront him. What could he possibly want from me? I decided to change my study schedule, thinking I could escape from that disturbing man. I started going to the library at different times, believing that he wouldn't be there. But to my horror, he always seemed to anticipate my changes. It didn't matter if I went in the morning, afternoon, or evening, he was always there, finding me with the same unsettling gaze and uncomfortable questions. It was driving me crazy. I couldn't focus on my studies anymore. I started avoiding the library altogether, but even then, I couldn't shake the suffocating feeling of being followed. One day, as I was heading home, I saw him standing on the corner of my street, watching my house. My heart froze. How did he know where I lived? Paranoia started to grow inside me, and I couldn't ignore the constant fear that he was lurking around everywhere I went. I felt cornered, violated in my own privacy. That man seemed to have become a shadow in my life, something I couldn't escape from. I became increasingly alert, jumping at any noise, afraid that he might show up at any moment. I couldn't feel safe anywhere anymore. A few days went by without any sign of that strange man, and I started to think maybe he had given up, that it was all just my imagination fueled by stress. I allowed myself to believe that I had finally rid myself of the shadow that had been haunting me. But then, on a rainy night, I was jolted awake by persistent banging on the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the rain, but the knocks grew louder and more insistent, as if someone was trying to force their way in. Terror took over at that moment. I rushed to the phone and desperately called the police, my hands trembling with fear. I waited, heart pounding, imagining the door breaking open and that disturbing man appearing. When the police finally arrived, they searched the area but found no one. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only the terror he had planted in my mind. There were no traces, No signs of forced entry. It all seemed like a hallucination. Even after that terrifying night, the fear continued to haunt me relentlessly. I avoided going out alone whenever possible, and I checked the locks several times before going to bed, with paranoia taking over. That library, once a peaceful refuge, now seemed like a sinister place where any shadow could hide the disturbing man who had been stalking me. He had invaded not just my routine but also my peace of mind. Every noise in the dead of night, every unfamiliar figure I saw on the street, brought back the overwhelming fear that he was nearby, waiting, watching. To this day, I live with the constant feeling that he will come back, that he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to reappear in my life. And the worst part is not knowing what he really wants from me. Is it just my imagination, or does this man have sinister plans? The uncertainty and constant vigilance consume more and more of my sanity.
That should have been a nice, chill day. I had just left school and was excited about spending the afternoon at the mall, browsing through stores, and enjoying some me time. The mall was my favorite spot where I could relax and take a break from the routine. As soon as I arrived, I started exploring the windows and checking out the latest store items. That's when I noticed something weird. A man, probably in his 40s, seemed to be watching me from across the store I was in. It struck me as odd, but I thought it might just be a coincidence and continued with my day. Gradually, though, I began to realize that this man was discreetly following me through the stores. He kept his distance, but I could feel his intense stare. A chill ran down my spine and a growing panic started to take over. Despite my discomfort, I decided not to leave. I didn't want that strange man to force me to cut my outing short. I kept walking through the stores, trying to stay calm and not draw too much attention. But the feeling of being followed didn't go away. I looked around and always saw him there at a distance, keeping tabs on me. My heart was racing and I knew I had to do something, but fear had me paralyzed. Finally, I decided to go into a busier store, hoping to blend in with the crowd and lose sight of him. But when I glanced back discreetly, there he was, standing at the store entrance, watching me. Even though I was increasingly uncomfortable, I decided not to let him intimidate me. I continued browsing the mall, stopping at various stores. However, every new store I entered, that same man was nearby, pretending to be interested in the merchandise, but always keeping his eyes fixed on me. His behavior was unsettling. He wasn't buying anything, didn't talk to anyone. He just moved through the same aisles I did, keeping a safe distance, but never missing a chance to stare. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence, but the frequency with which he appeared in my path began to really scare me. My mind raced with all sorts of possibilities, each one darker than the last. Why was he following me? What could he want? The feeling of being watched and pursued became suffocating. Despite my fear, I decided not to leave. I didn't want to let that man force me to cut short my outing. I kept walking through the stores, trying to stay calm and not draw too much attention, but it was almost impossible to ignore his constant presence. Every time I looked back, there he was, watching me with that piercing and unsettling gaze. After a while, I realized I could no longer ignore the situation. The constant feeling of being followed and observed was just overwhelming. I decided to move away from the stores and went to the food court, hoping to blend in with the crowd and finally lose sight of him. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. But then, I felt a presence behind me and, when I turned around, there he was, smiling in a weird and creepy way. Without hesitation, he started talking to me, as if we already knew each other. He asked my name, where I lived, and if I was alone. My heart raced and I could barely breathe at such a direct and invasive approach. I quickly answered, trying not to show the panic I felt, and moved away as fast as I could, saying I needed to go to the bathroom. I ran to the nearest restroom, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to figure out what to do next. I looked at myself in the mirror, frightened by my own expression of terror. What did that man want with me? How had he found me so easily in the crowd? I stood there, leaning against the wall, trying to control my breathing and think of an escape, but fear and uncertainty clouded my thoughts. Maybe that man had finally given up following me? After a while, I left the restroom, looking carefully around. The hallway was empty, and a sense of relief started to wash over me. I decided it was best to go home as soon as possible, so I started heading towards the mall exit. However, before I could reach it, I felt that presence near me again. It was him. As if he knew exactly where I was headed, he appeared in front of me, blocking my way. Now, his behavior was even more disturbing. He tried to strike up a conversation, saying it seemed like we were meant to meet. My fear turned into pure panic at that moment. I was trapped in a twisted game, not knowing how to escape. My heart was racing and my hands were trembling as he got closer, invading my personal space. I needed to think quickly, but terror paralyzed my movements. I looked around, searching for help or an escape route, but there was no one nearby. I was alone, at the mercy of that strange and threatening man. With my heart pounding, I ran desperately into a large department store, looking for a security guard. I quickly told him what was happening, my voice shaking as I explained how scared I was of the strange man who seemed to be following me. The security guard tried to calm me down and escorted me to the mall exit, keeping a vigilant eye around. As we left, I looked over my shoulder several times, but the man seemed to have finally disappeared. The security guard stayed with me until my bus arrived, and I got on as quickly as I could, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. I had finally escaped that terrifying situation. But even at home, the fear didn't leave me. Every time I went out, I felt like I was being watched, as if that man could appear again at any moment, like a shadow that never fades.
That rainy and depressing afternoon felt like it was weighing on me, as if the gray sky itself reflected my mood. After leaving college a bit later than usual, I found myself alone at the bus stop, with only a few strangers nearby. Huddled under the shelter, I tried to keep warm while listening to the rain and the sound of cars passing by. That's when I noticed a man approaching. His soaked clothes showed that he didn't care about the bad weather. At first, I didn't pay much attention, but soon his proximity and the way he was staring at me started to really bother me. That fixed gaze and empty smile sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the sound of the rain, but it was impossible. It felt like he was testing me, trying to see how far I would go before feeling threatened by his presence. I looked around, hoping to see more people at the stop, but we were practically alone. That isolation, combined with the feeling of being watched, made me feel extremely vulnerable. I prayed for the bus to arrive soon, so I could get out of there as fast as possible. But the bus didn't come. Time seemed to drag on, and the rain wouldn't let up. The man was still there, getting closer, staring at me with that disturbing smile. My heart was pounding, and panic started to take over. I needed a way out of that situation, but there was no one around to help. The wait became more and more agonizing, and the feeling of being at the mercy of that threatening stranger left me completely terrified. What was going to happen next? I couldn't stop imagining the worst-case scenarios. That mysterious man didn't seem willing to leave me alone. After silently watching me for a while, he finally started some small talk about the weather and asked if I was also waiting for the bus. His voice was soft, but there was something unsettling about it that made me even more uncomfortable. Even though I didn't want to, I politely answered, trying to keep eye contact to a minimum. I hoped the conversation would end there, but to my surprise, he kept asking questions. He asked about college, what I was studying. At first, it seemed like just casual chat, but soon the questions started getting too personal. He wanted to know where I lived, who I lived with, and even what time my parents got home. I tried to answer vaguely, hoping he'd give up, but his persistence in getting these details made me increasingly uneasy. My discomfort had turned into growing fear. I didn't want to show how uneasy I was, afraid of triggering some unexpected or unpredictable reaction from that man. My heart was racing, and I was praying for the bus to come soon and take me away from this distressing situation. The rain wouldn't stop, and I felt more and more vulnerable and at the mercy of that disturbing stranger. I needed to find a way to divert his attention or just get out of there, but I didn't know what to do. Panic started to take over, and I couldn't think clearly. I felt increasingly isolated at that bus stop, like the world had shrunk down to just me and that strange man. The sound of the rain pounding on the shelter drowned out any other noise, making me feel even more vulnerable. He wouldn't stop talking, but now his tone had changed, becoming more suggestive and dark. His words, laced with threats, made my skin crawl. He mentioned how dangerous the city could be at night, especially for a young woman alone. As he said this, his eyes remained firmly fixed on mine, like he was assessing my reactions. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I started desperately searching for an escape route. My eyes scanned the street, and that's when I noticed the small convenience store not too far away. Maybe if I could make it there, I could find safety and escape from this threatening man. The problem was, how to walk away without him noticing my panic. I didn't want to risk triggering some violent or unpredictable reaction. I needed to act cautiously, but my heart was pounding uncontrollably, and fear was starting to consume my thoughts. The situation seemed to drag on forever, and I felt more and more cornered. I needed to find a way out, but with every move I made, I feared I might set off something terrible. I looked again at the store, praying for the bus to arrive soon and take me away before it was too late. I tried to mask my anxiety, pretending to check my phone for the time. With my heart racing, I mumbled something about going to buy something at the store and took a step back, trying to move away from that man without seeming desperate. But he didn't let me go so easily. He stepped forward, partially blocking my path, and asked if I was sure I wanted to go out in the rain. His voice was syrupy, almost mocking, and it sent another chill down my spine. Forcing a nervous smile, I said I'd be right back. When he hesitated for a moment, I saw my chance to escape. Without thinking twice, I ran across the street toward the small convenience store. My heart felt like it was about to explode as I crossed the street, the quick footsteps behind me echoing in my mind, even though I couldn't really hear them. The only thing that mattered was reaching that safe place, where I could take shelter from the rain and that threatening man. Finally, I entered the convenience store, feeling immediate relief when I heard the bell on the door. I looked back, but there was no sign of him. Inside the store, I finally felt safe and protected from that threatening man. Still out of breath, I approached the clerk and quickly explained what had happened at the bus stop. He looked at me with concern, but when we looked out the window, the stranger was gone. The street looked as empty and calm as before, and the rain kept falling relentlessly. Other customers came and went from the store, unaware of my panic and inner turmoil. I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if maybe I had overreacted. Minutes passed as I tried to calm down until finally, a friend arrived to pick me up. On the way home, I tried to explain what had happened, but something inside me told me that wasn't the end of it. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I started avoiding the bus stop, always looking over my shoulder, but I could never forget that man's piercing gaze. Even now, every time it rains, I feel a chill down my spine, like he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to get close again. That experience left a deep mark on me, casting a shadow of fear and distrust that seems unwilling to leave. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake off this feeling that something terrible is still coming.